Hi everyone, welcome to episode 2 of our full stack mobile development series. In today's episode, we are going to focus on building our authentication endpoint, which is going to be the registration, the verification, the password reset, as well as the login. Now to do this, we'll go ahead and open our Laravel project in Visual Studio Code. We would want to make some few modifications to our current migrations. We have the users table, which has the name, the email verify that and the password. Now we want to add a new column called soft delete. Now this soft delete would create a new column called deleted at. And the aim of doing this is such that when we delete a user or when we delete the record of a user, we do not entirely remove the user from the database. We rather just set the deleted at to the current timestamp, which marks the user as a deleted user in our system. Also, we want to add another column after the ID called UUID. And now this is because by default, Laravel uses auto increment big integers for primary keys. That means if the new user registers, the person becomes user 1. If another person registers, the person becomes user ID 2, 3, 4, and so on. However, what happens is when you send this kind of information to the front end, it's easy for users to guess what the next record could be, or the presence of a record based on the numbers. So if I'm user 64, then I know there are 63 users before me. We do not want to do that. We rather want to send a UUID string, which looks like this. And in this case, it's hard for the user to guess what the next record is. So that is the UUID. By default, the name of the column is UUID. So we don't want to change that. We are going to go to the .env file. If you do not have the .env file, you could make a copy of the .env example, and then we are going to make a few changes. We are going to first change this into Penger, which is the name of our app. We have HTTPS enabled, and then we are going to change this from SQLite to MySQL. That's the database we are using. Uncomment these lines. These are defaults. This is the default port for MySQL. The name of our database, we created it in the previous episode, is called Penger, and our password for the MySQL root account is password. Now, once this is done, Laravel can connect to the database. We can test that by running our first migration. This will create these 3 tables. We can do that by opening the integrated terminal in Visual Studio Code and then run php artisan migrate. Now, artisan is an inbuilt command line tool with Laravel that gives you option to do several activities such as create migrations, create controllers, create views, and resources, a lot of things. In this case, we want to run php artisan migrate, which is to run our database migrations and create these files. Now, to verify that this has happened, we can go to our terminal, connect to our MySQL database using the terminal, enter the password, which is in this case is password. We are going to first show databases, and we have our database, which is Penger. We can switch to use Penger and then show the tables. We should include the tables we just created. In this case, we have the tables, which is the user sessions and personal, the password reset tokens. Great. Now we would then go ahead and create our route for the newer versions of Laravel. That's after Laravel 11. When you go to the routes folder, you do not have the API file, and that's because out of the box, Laravel 11 does not come with the API file. And to enable the API file, you will need to run the php artisan command again. In this case, we are going to say install API. Now this will create the API file and also install Laravel Sanctum, which is going to be used for generating our personal access tokens for the APIs. Now, one new migration has been created, and you can confirm by going to migrations, and this is the personal access tokens. And yes, we want to first migrate it, and then it has happened. We've added scaffolding to your user trait model. All right, so it's telling us to add the has API tokens to our user trait model. So we would want to go to our models, the user model, and then we say that it has API tokens. Great. Now this will import the Laravel Sanctum as API tokens. That means the user can create personal access tokens, and this has already been migrated to our database. We can double check by running the show tables again, and we should have 10 instead of 9, which is the personal access tokens. That is nice. Okay, now we would have the routes file. We do not want these routes, so we would want to create our routes. Now we will need a register route. We will need the login route. We will need the route for verification, and we also need the route for logging in. Great. So to do that, we will just get rid of this. Now, when a request comes in through a route, we receive it at a route, we pass it to a controller. The controller then just reads the request, interprets the request, and returns the result. So that means we will need to create a controller that will handle this route. And to do that, we can simply run PHP artisan, make controller. I would want to put the controllers in a folder, the API controllers in a folder called API, because we're going to have the web controllers for the admin dashboard. So in this case, I'm going to call it API/auth controller. Now this should create the API, create in the controllers, create a folder called API, and you have the auth controller. Now this will receive the request that comes in from the user at the 4 endpoints you're going to create and then process it. Now we then go ahead and create our route. Now, because we have several routes hitting the same controller, we want to group them. So we say controllers, we want to use the class itself. So we import the class and we say that group, and here we are going to open our function. Great. So the first route will be a post request to register, and that would hit the register method. And we want to give a name to this register route, and we're going to call it API auth register. So that means anywhere in the application, if you reference a route named API auth register, you would receive the /register as the result. Okay, and we want to do another thing. We want to do the login, and then we want an endpoint for OTP and that. But we first want to do the login and register, and then we add a few other ones. Now, when we come in here, we can then go ahead and create our function, which is our public function called register. We need to specify return type. We are going to do that afterwards. So in our register, we want to attack the process in 4 different steps. The first step is to validate the request from the user to make sure that it has all the fields that we have. And once we have that, we are going to create the user. Once we create the user, we're going to create the access token for the user to be able to authenticate on subsequent API requests. And then we are going to return the response, right? So to do the first part, we will need a request from the user, and we can get it from here. We add a request, which is injected there. We add a request, and we can call validate on the request and supply the rules for validation. In this case, when the user is registering, they need to provide their name, email, and password. So those are the 3 things. So we need to provide their name. Now, once you put the name of the field that you want to validate, then you provide the rules for the validation. In this case, the name is required. And then this name has to be a string, and the name has to be of a maximum 255 characters, right? We do the same thing for the email. However, we change the string to email, and we want to make sure that when the user registers in our system with a specific email address, we do not want another user to register with the same email address. So we need to apply the unique validation rule. Now that takes a column, a table, a column, and an except and the ID. So in this case, we have the users, and the column is the email column, and we do not want to do any except ID. And then the last thing is the password, and it's also required. It should be a maximum of 255 characters, right? And then it should have a minimum of 6. So your password should have at least 6 characters and a maximum of 255 characters. Great. All right, another approach for writing these validation is to, instead of using the pipe, use an array. For example, I could say this is required, and then should have a minimum of 6 characters and a maximum of 255. So you can either go with a pipe or use the array. Those are two approaches. So we can as well switch the entire thing to this or use the pipe. But in this case, we are just going to stick with the pipe approach. In case you see it in other Laravel projects, you know that they basically do the same thing. Great. So now once the request has been validated, we go ahead and create the user and create the access token. Now let's test the validation to make sure that everything works perfectly. To test the endpoints we are working on, we can simply use Postman. So I have Postman installed and I'm going to create a blank collection. I'm going to rename this and call it the Penger APIs. And then I'm going to create a new folder. And in this folder, I'm going to call it Authentication. And then we add our first request. So here we have the https penger.test/api/register. If you look at our routes here, we said that you hit the register with a post request. So let's see what happens when we go on a get request. So when we get on a get request, we get a 405, which is method not allowed error. But before we do anything, there's one more thing I want to do. Because we are doing this over the API, we want to send and receive JSON requests. To make sure that what we are sending and receiving is a JSON request, we want to go to the headers and change the accept to application JSON. That means that the response is going to come in a JSON format. So now we have the same error, but however, in this case, in the JSON request, it's telling us that it does not support a get method, only a post. So let's switch this to a post and run the same thing and see. Now we have our validation. It's telling you the fields that are required. So we go to our body, we switch to form data, we specify the name. In this case, I'm going to use my name, so I'm going to say Bernard Safo. And I'm going to use my email address, which is devsafo@gmail.com. And then the password, I'm going to call the password at 1, right? Capital P. Good. Now let's see what happens if I do not send the password. Now, if I do not send the password, it complains about the password. Once I send everything, it tells us 200. Okay, that means that the validation has completed successfully. Great. Now we can move on to do the next thing. So I'm going to show you two approaches here. The first one is the common approach you find in some Laravel projects, and then we are going to switch to the one that, in my opinion, is the best way to do some of these things. So you'll find out that most people create a user. Not most people, some people would create a user directly in the controller here. Supply the name from the request. In this case, it's the name, the email, and the password. Now, because our user model has a cast on the password called hash, you can either do hash.make and pass this, which will hash the password, or directly pass this and the ORM mode hash the password for you. Great. Now, once this is done, we want to import our user model here. This will create the user in the database. And then once the user has been created, we want to create a token. So we say user create token. And we are getting access to this create token because we added the has API tokens trait to our to the user, right? So we added a trait to the user. So the user can now create tokens. We give a name of this token and we say the auth token, plain test token. So this will return the string for the access token. And then we return the response, which is our array of our message when the user has, we say the user registered successfully. And then we are going to return our results as an array, which has the user, which is the user, as well as the token, which is the token. Great. Now, once this is done, our endpoint is complete. We have to also specify the response type. because this response would return an illuminate HTTP response, and we have to make sure that we type our API methods. We have to specify the return type for the methods. Great. So we have our registration done. We can easily test this by sending this, and it's complaining about the UUID field. So remember, we added a new field called the UUID, and because it is not nullable, we need to set that field anytime we are creating the data. So we go to our fillable. We first need to add a UUID here, and to create a UUID, we have the Laravel helper to string UUID, and this is coming from the UID, the Laravel Illuminate support. So we can just go here, use Illuminate support string. Good. So now we have this UID, which will generate a UID version 4 for us. Now we can go ahead and test again, but before that, we want to make a correction here. Plain test token. Yes. So we go to our system and then we create. So now we have our API response. It says 200 okay with this. We want to, now what you see is we return the ID, the UID, and this is the user's token. Now we do not want to return exactly this to the front end. So what we are going to do is we are going to use something called the resources. So we are going to create that using PHP artisan make resources. And here we're going to call it the user resource. Now this is going to create a folder in the app HTTP called resources, which will transform the resource, which is our model, into the array as we want it. So we are going to first take away everything here. And then we want to return the name, the email, the ID, as well as the email verify that and all those kind of things. So we want to first return the ID. Now, in this case, you are not going to return the auto increment ID. We are going to rather return the UUID. And then we have the name, which is the person's name, the email, which is the person's email, the email verified at, and then we want to have the created at, which is when it was created, and then we want to have the updated at as well. Brilliant. So now when the user is created, we want to first just change this and say that return a new resource of this user. So this will map the user model to this array that we have defined here. So anything that is not in this array will not be returned to the front end. That's a better way of returning the API responses, returning the models to the front end. All right, so we can go ahead and test this. Now there's going to be an error, and I'm going to explain that. That's because the email has already been taken because I've been registered. So I'm just going to go ahead and add +1, which makes the email different. And I'm going to register now. I have an ID, which is a UUID, my name, my email verified that is now. So that means I've not verified my email. So the Flutter application would then route the user to the verification email, the email verification screen, right? And this is our token. This is what we are going to make use to make our subsequent API calls. Now, one last thing we want to change is that now you see what happened here is we created the user directly in the controller. That means if I want to create another controller somewhere and say user controller where we want to create users, right? What happens is that we have to then duplicate this entire code. Or let's say if something happens, for example, in this application, when the user registers, the user has to receive a verification code, right? The logic around the registration process all has to be in the controller, and that's one, in my opinion, that's one thing I do not like when developers try to put such logic in the controllers, especially with Laravel. So most people tend to use action classes, but in this case, we are going to use a simple approach, which is the service class. So in the app folder, we are going to create a new folder called services, which is going to store all our business logic. And I'm going to create a file called authservice.php. So I'm going to open my PHP specify the namespace. In this case, it's app/services because it's in the app/services folder. And I'm going to create my class called auth service. Great. Now in this class, I'm going to have a public function called register, which is going to take the object, which has the first name, last name, and then it's supposed to return the user we just created, right? And we have to import the user. Good. Okay, so it's complaining because in our code we are not currently doing that. So what we are going to do is I'm going to move this entire block into this and then return the user. Now it's going to complain for the string, and that's because we did the string here, and then I'm going to add that up here. Good. So now this function would create the user, and if there's any other business logic regarding creating the user, it would happen here, and then return the user response, the result to the controller, which would just return it to the user, because we want to use the controller as our IO. It takes in a request, passes it to the service handles whatever it's supposed to do, and return it back to the user. Okay, so to do that, we first need to inject the auth service into our auth controller. And to do that, we are going to create a protected auth service, which is auth service. And it's going to be a local variable. And then we need to create our constructor. And then we have our class constructor. We have this here. And then this means auth service is equal to auth service. So anytime we instantiate the auth controller, it would inject the auth service we have here, and that will be available in the entire class. So here we change this, and then we call it the auth service, and we have register, right? And we pass the request. Great. So at this point, the user would have been registered, and we return the token to the user. So this is it. Comparing this to this, you realize that whenever you then need to do this exact same thing in any other controller, you just have to inject the class, the service, and then you can call it. Now we can go ahead and test this again. I just have to change this to 2 and then run it again. So it still works. That is brilliant. Another thing, you realize that we are hard coding the message we return to the user, and it's currently in English. Now, the problem here is if you are building an application which is supposed to support multiple languages. For example, you have an application that's supposed to provide localization in French and Spanish, in Norwegian. This would be incorrect message to return to the user. And that's one thing I like about Laravel. Laravel out of the box provides you localization, which allows you to build a multilingual system with no struggle. So to do this, we would open our integrated terminal. I'm going to clear this, and we are going to run PHP artisan and say lang publish. Now this is going to create a folder called lang. Has by default has one folder, which is E, and that's the key for English, and you have these files in there. So we are going to create a new file called app.php. You can just duplicate the authentication, and we call this application language files. It's going to be used during the app during the application for various messages here in the application. Yeah, good. So here we are just going to change this into the message that we want to return. When a user is registered successfully, we copy this and we say that registration success, right? So this will return an array of keys and values. So just fix this typo here. Good. Then we change this and we say that app.registration success. And as you can see, I already have the Laravel extensions enabled. I've installed Laravel extensions, so I get these hints in my Visual Studio Code. Great. We are going to test the same thing. again, and then we are going to change this to 3, and then good. Now I get this message, and that's because we have a typo here. Great. So it's registration success. Now email is already there. We test this again. Good. Now we have our message. Now, if you have another language, assuming you have the application in French, right? So I'm going to copy this and then call this French, and then I'm just going to change this to French. Good. And then I'm going to put this, is going to return this string. So this is the French version of it. Let's test the French version. We go to the environment, the .env file, and we change the app locale to fr, which is French. And we go to Postman and we change the email here. Let's run this again. Now, before we run it, we had this record, which is for this user registered successfully. Now we've changed it to French. Now let's run this thing again. You realize the message is in French, right? So that is one way of making the system multilingual. You can also take the language from the user, assuming the user comes from a French, you can detect it from the application or from the browser and then return the language. But this is another way where you set the app locale. Right? For now, we're just going to set it back to English and then increase this to 7 and send it again. Now we have it in English. Perfect. That is our registration endpoint. Everything works. We just want to clean up a page, removed unused import. Great. Finally, because this is creating a resource, I would want to change the status code by default, which is 200 to 201. And you can see the difference here. When we send this, it sends us a 200 OK. But now when we send the same thing, we should get 201 created. That means the user has been created successfully. And that is our registration endpoint. The next thing we want to set up is the verification. But before that, let's handle the login. Because we've already registered the user, we just want to handle the login endpoint. To do that, we are going to create a function. The same thing, we can go ahead and duplicate this, and we just rename it to login. For the login, we do not need the name. We rather want the email, and we do not want to check if it's unique or not. So we have the email and the password which is required. Here we are going to log in the user, create the access token, and return the response. And in this case, we are going to return a response 200 OK, because we are not creating anything, we are just retrieving the resource. Great. So here we're going to change this to login, and then we go to our auth service. At this point, we just need to duplicate this also, and we're going to return the user. But here we do not create the user. So what we are going to do is the user gives us a username and a password. So we want to make sure that the username and the password combination matches. To do that, we first get the user based on that email, right? So based on that email, we get from the request. Another approach to writing this is you could also do where email and pass this. But yeah, these are the two approaches. You can also do this. And then you say first. So this will return the user if it exists, or null if it does not. Now, if the user does not exist, so that means we do not get any resource from the user, or the password. So here we're going to check the password. Okay. So if the user does not exist, or the password is wrong, which in this place is hash check, and for the check we have to pass our value, which is what the user is giving us, and the one from the database, which is the user.password. So we are checking if the user exists, and so if the user exists and the password matches the password, then we know we have a user. Then we return the user. who has logged in, right? If not, then we have to return now. So what then we have to update here is you have to update this and say that now. This is one approach. Another approach is you let the service class abort it, but for this purpose, you're just going to return the user if it's the user exists and the password matches the password we have in the database. If not, we return now. You can invert this, but yeah. All right. So now we have set up the login, which returns an allowable user based on whether the user has a valid username and password. Once we log in the user, what happens is that at this point, we want to make sure that we have a user. And if we do not have a user, then we return the response telling the user that the username and the password was wrong. And I could just go ahead and copy this. And then, yeah, good. And I don't have the token. I'm just returning a message telling the user that the login failed. So I'm going to rely on the language files we created. By default, Laravel has auth.field, which says that these credentials do not match our records. So we can rely on that and just say auth failed. And once it's filled, we have to return an error code. So we have error 401, which is unauthorized. Now let's put this to a test. So we first have to rename this. This was our register endpoint. We are going to duplicate it and call this one our login endpoint. And this goes on to login. And then we don't need a name here, right? Now let's provide a wrong username and password and see what happens. So now when we do this, it tells us that these credentials do not match our records. And it says 401 unauthorized. So it's trying to tell you that the authentication has failed, right? It's similar to 403 forbidden. Great. Now what happens if the user has a valid email and a password? Then we go ahead and we process everything and we return the user the token 200. But here we say login success. So we go to our app, we duplicate this line and say login successful, and we say login successful, right? And we're going to make another change to this, but let's just for now test this. Great. Now we have this. Let's provide a valid username and password. Now, once we log in, it gives us login successful. Okay. Another thing here is you realize that the email verified that is null. Okay. So we want to make a change. When we detect that the email verified that is now, we want the user to verify. So we want to pass that as part of the message. And to do that, we'll first go into our app language. We are going to update first the registration and say registration is success verify. So here we will tell the user that registration successful. Okay. And then in the second one, we'll say registration successful. Please verify account with OTP. Okay, so we want to tell the user that we want to probably use an exclamation mark here. Login successful. And we do the same thing. Verify. Right. So the same thing. Please verify account with OTP. So every time the user logs in and the account is not verified, we just want to show that they need to verify the account with an OTP. So we go up ahead here in the registration and we change this to verify, because we know that by default when they register the account is not verified. But for the login, we want to check if the user email verified that is null or not. So user email verified at. Now if this is set, then we want to do this. Sorry, we would want to do this up here. If it's set, then you return this. If not, you return verify. Right. Now, this is a ternary operation. We can also simplify this by saying that we take this here, because we know that the only difference is underscore verify. We have this, which returns nothing if it's verified, but if it's not, it returns underscore verify. Now, this means the same thing, that we take this and we append underscore verify if the email is not verified. So let's test this again. We are going to log in again. And because the email verified is now, it's telling us login successful. Please verify account with OTP. That is one. That is the login account with OTP. So that is the login endpoint working. So here we can register a user. I'm going to register a user and say that test@gmail.com, and then it's registered. And now I'm going to log in that user again here as test@gmail.com, and that should work. If I enter a wrong password, that should throw the 401 unauthorized, and that is our login endpoint. Beautiful. So we have everything set up. Great. Also, by default, because we know the response will always return a 200, we can remove this from the login because we're always going to return a 200. We only specify exactly what we want when it's different from 200. And we can go ahead and test this again. This is registration. We go ahead and test this again. Good. The login, and you realize every time the user logs in, they generate a token for them. Good. In today's episode, we've successfully completed the first part of our authentication API, where we set up the register and the login endpoint. In the next episode, we are going to look at how to set up the verification endpoint. We are going to use Gmail as our SMTP provider because it is free, and we are going to send the verification codes to the actual email addresses and then verify them with the verification endpoint. So stay tuned, subscribe if you have not, and hit the notification bell to be notified of the next episode. See you.